Welcome, everyone. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative here at the Atlantic Council, and we're delighted to have you here today, albeit virtually, to discuss the outlook for the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, as you all know, the Trump administration withdrew from the Jcpoa in 2018, and the Biden administration has been trying to revive it in indirect negotiations with Iran that have gone on since April of 2021. The talks have had enormous ups and downs, with progress and optimism followed by setbacks and stalemate. And at the present, the US and Iran have been trading comments on a European draft that was supposed to be the final draft and was put together and issued on August the 8th. So why hasn't it come together yet? We are going to be looking at that issue and others. What is keeping up resolution of the Jcpoa? What about the strategy and the motivation of the key parties? How has Iran's nuclear program advanced during this period? And what are the economic difficulties that Iran is experiencing despite its so-called resistance against US-led sanctions? As usual, we are very lucky that we have a very, very highly qualified panel of experts to look at all of these different aspects. We're going to start in Iran with my old friend Nasser Hadian, a professor of political science at the University of Tehran, who has deep expertise on the topic of US-Iran negotiations. Nasser will be followed by Kelsey Davenport, Director of Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, Azadeh Zaniriyad of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, who will talk about the European perspective. And finally, our own Nadereh Shamlu, who is a World Bank veteran and now a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And she will look at the impact of all this nuclear diplomacy on Iran's economy. As always, we welcome your questions and we will leave time for them. So please, as they occur to you, put them in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen and we will weave them into the conversation. So we're going to start with you, Nasser. Can the Jcpoa still be revived? And if so, what is it going to take from an Iranian perspective? And if you could deal in particular with the two issues that seem to be stumbling blocks now, Iran's dispute with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and also the question of guarantees. And anything else you would like to tell us about how Iran sees the status of the negotiations? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Baba, for inviting me and giving me a chance to discuss my point of view regarding the questions which you mentioned. First of all, I would like to begin and to end my talk with an optimist view. I'm hopeful, and I think we will have the Jcpoa either within the next 10 days or after US election. So that's the view that I have, because I think there is no other way, or extremely difficult to consider the alternative, which I will go to it in a few minutes. The alternatives are so bad that we don't have any other way but to go back to the Jcpoa. Almost all parties know that the alternatives are very bad. But now, what are the alternatives? The alternatives basically are either continuation of status quo, which can take two forms. Which they can take two forms, and or escalation. The continuation of status quo, the two forms are: one, what we call freeze for freeze. Basically, we don't do anything, neither of us, as unwritten agreement. We can oblige ourselves to not escalate, to remain where we are. In other words, we are still enriching uranium, centrifuges are spinning, sanctions are there, and that's exactly what you're going to do. I mean, once in a while, of course, you are going to have some new sanctions, like just yesterday. There may be a statement which basically was issued last night by the Board of Governors of the Iaea. And Iran would respond proportionally in a very measured way. So I would call these basically freeze for freeze. And we should, in case of, I would go to it in a few minutes. In case of failure, I don't want to say failure, in case of not having the Jcpoa, we should push for this alternative, which I guess is more doable than the other alternatives. The next one within the continuation of status quo is basically a temporary agreement, exactly like what we had before the Jcpoa. So that's much more formal. There is a structure, there is obligation, rights, and duties for each side. I'm less hopeful for that. But if we can have that one, that would be good too. But I doubt that we can have that one. We can have sort of agreement, but we should push for again for it. So these are the continuation of status quo alternative. The other alternative is escalation, which is terrible. What would happen is in the next Board of Governments, Iran would be basically asked to do some stuff. Basically, if we have not done it, then our file would be referred to UN Security Council for a resolution. Russia or China would veto that. Thus, you are going to go back, basically, Western countries are going to go back to the Jcpoa and use the snapback mechanism, which is veto proof, and thus the sanctions are going to return. And all the resolutions which were by the UN are going to return. Thus, what would Iran do, as they have already informed the European and the others? We are going to withdraw not only from the Jcpoa, but from the NPT. And Iran is going to go for what I have called it constructive ambiguity. Once there is no camera, no inspector, nothing there, then you have to guess what we are doing. That would put all the countries at edge, and thus US is going to threaten that if you do not do this and that, we are going to do this or that. And they're going to bring a number of aircraft carrier to the region, and Iran is going to have a totally military posture throughout the region in order to prepare itself for a regional war. I repeat, a regional war. It's not going to be a US-Iran war. It's going to be a regional war. And any action, any incident can ignite it. So it is a very terrible scenario even to contemplate. Thus, we have to do our best to prevent this scenario from being realized, being actualized. So because all these alternatives are, because all of these alternatives are not good, thus the best case for us would be to go back to the Jcpoa. But now we are so close to it. What are the problems? Why we don't have it yet? A part of it goes back to what happened, because I have been involved in last few days, Barbara. I've been discussing repeatedly for hours with different groups in Iran, very influential groups, influential individuals regarding this issue. At the core of the issue is mistrust. At the core is mistrust from America. They are very worried that even President Biden would not abide by its promises, would not fulfill its promises. Certainly, they think that the next Republican US president would withdraw from the Jcpoa. Thus, they want some sort of a guarantee that's secure, or make it much harder for them to withdraw at will or because of the domestic politics of US from the Jcpoa. That's at the core of the issue. Number two is a sort of a political issue here, and that's the debate basically within the principalists themselves, and what you may call portion of major good portion of the hardliners. First of all, they will have a hard time to convince the constituency that's a better deal than Zarif and Araghchi could have gotten. The reality is it is not all that different. On a couple of points, they might have gotten something, but on other points, for instance, Revolutionary Guard still is there, but it could have not been listed under Zarif or Araghchi. So there are some positive things which they can claim victory, but also there are some things which they have lost. But in general, they will have a hard time to convince their constituency why you waited so long, why people suffer so much. That deal was at hand a year ago. They could have had it. But also reformists are going to basically, a majority of them, although Zarif and a number of others have said that they are going to defend the deal. No matter what is in it, we are going to defend it. But still, there are many reformists who would say that that was very much a political decision. The whole issue was election. You just wanted to eliminate or to remove the reformist. Thus, you waited this long. There was nothing there. You couldn't get anything significantly more than was available then. So that's also a political issue which is being debated within the principalists themselves. So, but still, I'm hopeful because even within the principalists, there are at least two main groups. One which would argue you have to go finish the Jcpoa. We should put it behind ourselves, and there are enough things there that we can claim victory, and that would be good for the country. To the best of my knowledge, President Raisi and Shamkhani both agree with this perspective, that we have to finish it. And I guess when US responded, and when Iran responded to the US request, the first round was very much under the influence of these people. But the latest response, which Iran provided, was an indication to me as an observer that the other group, not Shamkhani and Raisi, basically Revolutionary Guard, not all of them, of course, Quds Force support the Jcpoa. But the rest basically have a reservation. And they are very distrustful of the US, and they think we have to clarify. It's not that they want a lot more. To me, there is nothing significant that they are asking for in terms of the benefits. They want to clarify some issues, that there is not room for interpretation in the future. That's their exact word to me. We just don't want to leave room for alternative explanations in the future. So that's one part of it. They are not worried about basically Iaea and their request. They're ready to give response, legitimate response to the Iaea's questions, provided there is a structure there. For instance, there should be 1 or 2 rounds of questioning, and that should be it. It just cannot continue indefinitely because of the mistrust. And we have been arguing that with this president, that has been my argument, and with Rob Malley, I don't want to say certain, but I'm almost sure they are not going to play with the game. If they promise, which apparently they have made the promise, that they are not going to play a game. And once the responses are there, they're going to close the file. And it just, and they, again, they want to be close it forever. In other words, the Israelis cannot come back 6 months from now, a year from now, with new information and claiming that, okay, these are new, and we have to, Iran should respond and again have the open file, open-ended file there. So that's why they are worried. But anyway, the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization are confident that they can provide the responses for the question. So that's why, for me, it is not the most important issue. But the next issue, but 1 minute and I'll finish.
Okay.
But the next one would be the guarantees. In other words, they want to be sure that, we are going to get the benefit that we are supposed to get. It is not that we are asking for more sanction relief. No. They are not asking for the listing of the Revolutionary Guard or whatever. They want just to make sure that we are going to get the benefit, and US is not going to use some tricks like a dollar U-turn, so forth and so on, or one issue which they raised to me, these hardliners, so-called hardliners, was that, they may use terrorism authority or other authorities to impose sanction exactly for the things which have been removed by this agreement, by the Jcpoa. Although in the original Jcpoa, and now they have promised that it is there, that they're not going to do it. But they are, as I said, they are not trust. They just cannot trust it. So that's what would worry them. And I was arguing with them. As long as this president or Mali is there, I'm almost confident they're going to deliver on what they have promised. So I stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You've teed that up very, very well for Kelsey, because I think one of the real problems, and Nasser was referring to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has been demanding explanations for why there were traces of uranium found at 3 locations in Iran that were not declared to the Iaea, which is supposed to account for all the nuclear materials in countries that are members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the question of promising that they'll deal with these questions, but not anymore, I think is a pretty ticklish one for any international institution. And I would just say also one other comment, that you talked about the first alternative being a kind of freeze for freeze. Well, Iran's nuclear program is not frozen, and every day that goes by, there is more and more and more enriched uranium. So, Nasser, thank you very much. We'll come back to you in a bit, and I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey to explain where we are in terms of the Iranian nuclear program, how much they have advanced, and whether there is a way to finesse this whole issue of the IAEA and its so-called safeguards questions for Iran. Kelsey, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara, so much. And thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this, and everybody for tuning in. It's really great to be here. So I'm going to start by talking about the IAEA safeguards investigation. And before I get into the details of that investigation, I want to actually begin by talking about what it is not, because I feel like the safeguards investigation is frequently mischaracterized in the media by policymakers in the United States. So it is not a continuation of the IAEA's investigation into the military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. That investigation was closed in 2015. So this is not about Iran's past illicit attempts to pursue nuclear weapons. And this is not actually even about the Jcpoa itself. What this investigation is about is Iran accounting for its nuclear materials and activities as required by its safeguards agreement, which is a legally binding document that Iran must meet as a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So essentially, what the IAEA has been investigating is evidence that Iran undertook nuclear activities that should have been declared under its safeguards agreement sort of prior to 2003. Even though these activities have long since ceased, Iran still has to account for these materials and activities under the safeguards agreement. And since 2018, when this investigation began, the IAEA has faced considerable challenges in getting from Iran technically credible explanations for why it detected uranium at 3 sites that were never declared to the agency. Essentially, after stalling the IAEA's inquiries for several years, Iran and the IAEA agreed in March of 2022 to a process for trying to resolve this investigation and ideally close it by the June 2022 board meeting. But essentially, the evidence or the information that Iran provided to the IAEA in response to the evidence about this uranium at these 3 locations was that the presence of uranium was caused by third-party sabotage, essentially, that the uranium particles had nothing to do with Iran's nuclear activities, and as I said, were a result of contamination. And that explanation really strains credulity when you look at kind of the composition of the particles and the strong body of evidence that the IAEA has. So as a result, in June of 2022, the IAEA essentially issued a report saying it couldn't close the investigation because Iran's responses were not technically credible. And it actually released a finding that at one of the 4 sites under investigation, Iran did indeed undertake nuclear activities that should have been declared under its safeguards agreement. So essentially, there's already a considerable body of proof and assessment that Iran has failed to meet its safeguards obligations. And unsurprisingly, this led to the IAEA Board of Governors passing a resolution urging Iran to cooperate with the IAEA and censuring it for failing to do so. And since that time, there has been no engagement between Iran and the IAEA on trying to resolve this issue. So I just want to again underscore here that this is not a JCPOA issue. I said this is a safeguards issue, and it will persist irrespective of the status of the JCPOA. I mean, if one of the parties were to declare, negotiations to restore the JCPOA as dead, the IAEA will still need to pursue these questions because Iran is legally required to meet its safeguards obligations. And the IAEA needs to account for this nuclear material to be able to provide some assurance that Iran's nuclear program is entirely peaceful. So even though this issue is not, directly tied to the JCPOA, Iran has attempted to tie a resolution of the safeguards issue to the agreement to restore the accord, as Nasser mentioned. But what Iran is demanding from the JCPOA restoration text are not conditions that the United States and the P4+1 can agree to. They cannot predetermine the outcome of the investigation, and they cannot pressure the IAEA to prematurely conclude the investigation, because there are much broader issues at stake. The IAEA has a mandate for nuclear material accountancy to implement safeguards, and this would set a terrible precedent from a non-proliferation perspective if Iran weren't held accountable, for accounting for these materials and activities that it did not declare to the IAEA. Additionally, the United States and its partners cannot commit to the agency not pursuing new evidence of undeclared nuclear activities. They cannot, prematurely decide that once this investigation is closed, the IAEA cannot follow up on new evidence about other activities. Again, because the IAEA has a mandate and because Iran needs to meet its safeguards obligations. So what Iran is demanding now, essentially, could really be a deal killer for efforts to restore the JCPOA. Now, I will say the United States and its partners have made very clear that once the IAEA is satisfied, they are prepared to urge the IAEA's Board of Governors to drop this investigation. But they cannot say that there will be no further investigations into Iran, because if new evidence arises, the IAEA really does need to follow up on that. So that's kind of where the safeguards issue sort of is in relation to the negotiations. And as I said, there really is no space to negotiate on this. Iran needs to meet its commitments. The IAEA needs to be satisfied, before this investigation can be closed. And that's the bottom line. I mean, the US and others can continue to reiterate what they've said in the past, that they'll support closing the investigation when the IAEA is satisfied, but they can't really do much beyond that. So now I'll just turn quickly to your second question, sort of about the status of Iran's nuclear program and what that means for the talks. Because again, where Iran's nuclear program is right now, its trajectory over the coming months, really is quite troubling if these talks are stalled until after the midterm elections. But first, just to go back and kind of recap quickly, when Iran began violating the deal in 2019 in response to the Trump administration's violation and reimposition of sanctions, the actions that the Rouhani administration took were very carefully calibrated. These actions were reversible. They largely consisted of activities that Iran had undertaken prior to the Jcpoa's negotiation and implementation. So they could be quickly and easily unwound. They didn't really impact the non-proliferation benefits of the Jcpoa if the deal were restored. But that's really changed since December 2020 and early in 2021, and kind of has continued under the Raisi administration, where Iran has begun to undertake nuclear activities that are much more difficult to reverse because they result in the acquisition of new knowledge for Iran, and knowledge essentially that cannot be sort of unwound. So that includes, things like Iran's decision to enrich to 60%, a level that's very near weapons grade, its activities in uranium metal production and experimentation, operation of advanced centrifuges. All of that begins to impact the overall non-proliferation benefits of the deal. So as a result, if we look at where Iran's nuclear program is now, they're closer to a bomb than ever before. I mean, as a result of these advanced centrifuges, as a result of the enrichment to 60%, if Iran wanted to produce enough weapons grade material for a bomb, it could do so in under 10 days. And that time frame is very concerning, because Iran could try to do that, what a term we call breakout, could try to break out between IAEA inspections. And then raise, while it would still take, perhaps another 1 to 2 years to actually build a bomb, if Iran were to make the decision to break out to pursue a nuclear weapon, it could move that material to a covert facility, and it would be much more difficult to detect and disrupt that process. So even though I think there's absolutely no indication that Iran has made the decision to pursue nuclear weapons, the proliferation risk is much more serious now than it has ever been in Iran's nuclear history. Now, that short breakout, however, does not seem to be driving US calculations on how long it can engage in trying to restore the Jcpoa. The two things that seem to have much more of an impact on US thinking right now are those irreversible research and development gains that Iran makes, which, if Iran continues to invest in some of these new activities, the US will probably assess at some point that it cannot return to the Jcpoa because the non-proliferation benefits are not there. And the second, I think, more serious issue right now that has emerged in the last several months is the monitoring crisis. So in June of 2022, in response to the IAEA Board of Governors resolution censuring Iran for failing to cooperate on the safeguards agreement, Iran disconnected 27 cameras that were collecting data at key nuclear sites in Iran. And this is on top of Iran having already limited inspector access in February of 2021. So there's very minimal IAEA monitoring right now. And just this week, the IAEA released a report that essentially said that even if Iran cooperates, if it hands over the data, if it provides accurate accounting for its nuclear activities during this period of reduced transparency, there's no guarantee that the IAEA will be able to build an accurate record of Iran's activities and account for Iran's inventory, particularly of centrifuges. And what that will do, if there is uncertainty there, it's going to drive speculation that Iran diverted materials for a covert program, even if there's no evidence of that. The fact that the IAEA can't definitively account for those centrifuges, it's going to fuel critics of the Jcpoa in speculating that there's been illicit activity. So it will become much more difficult for the IAEA to to meet its monitoring obligations under a restored JCPOA. And it will be much more difficult to provide public confidence that the deal is verifiable sort of because of this monitoring crisis. So given the stalemate, I think Nasser raised the question, could we get a deal after the US midterms when it might be more politically feasible in the United States to reach a deal? And to be honest, based on Iran's nuclear trajectory, I'm not sure we can wait that long, particularly if we see any further sort of tit for tat escalations that drive Iran into engaging in new nuclear activities. I mean, as we've seen, throughout this past negotiation, Iran will respond to perceived provocations, new sanctions, actions by the Iaea board, by further ratcheting up its nuclear activities. And any further escalation, I think, really could, again, like I said, mitigate the JCPOA's benefits to the point where restoration of the deal is not possible. So I think to preserve space, we need to see restraint by both the United States and Iran. And I'll stop there and look forward to the rest of the questions and discussion.
Thanks very much, Kelsey. Let me quickly go back to Nasser. Do you think there's any chance that if a deal cannot be concluded, say, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly next week, that Iran would at least slow down some of the uranium enrichment or something as a confidence building measure to get us past the American midterm elections? Because it's very worrisome, obviously, if this continues, as Kelsey has pointed out.
First of all, I think basically Iran would like to have the deal before the election. This is the United States. This is the United States who is saying that, okay, because of the election midterm and because of the particular situation which the Democrats and the administration are in it, that we may have to wait until the election. But I guess Iran prefers to happen right now rather than before the election. Majority of it, of course, as I said, those hardliners who are somehow very much distrustful of the US, they prefer to wait. In fact, they are not all that worried that if, and they may prefer to make a deal with the Republicans. But anyway, let's put that aside. But going back to your question, there is a good chance if some intermediary like Qataris or Omanis to bring a proposal, mutual proposal, that just very simply only concentrating on a couple of issues. If you add 5 cameras plus slowing down the enrichment process, just only these 2, nothing more. We are ready to do this. It has a good chance, particularly if Raisi is in New York, which he is going to be. That would be good. In other words, he wants to give a sort of a message of hope to the Iranians. I guess he may be more, and the point is now he has very critical voice. Let me put it that way. He has the most important voice now, even more important than the Supreme Leader, because he has basically, he is in charge. He's in charge of his fight. So while he is there, if he's able to do something, even as a small point, as I mentioned, that would be good. He can portray that as a victory, as a very good trip, so forth and so on. That would be good for us to articulate a plan, very simple plan, just only concentrating on 1 or 2 issues.
Let me add to that, because there's a question. The first question actually that came in was about Iranian public opinion in regard to the JCPOA, and I've seen some poll results that suggest that it's not as popular as it was. But from what you say, it suggests that people would very much welcome something that would de-escalate the atmosphere. It certainly would have a positive impact on the mood of people, the economy, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're right. I mean, basically, the average citizen, I can say even above 80%, would prefer to have the deal.
Okay. I'm going to park all of this there for a moment. Now I'm going to go to Azadeh to talk about what the Europeans have been up to. Nasser suggests that maybe the Omanis and the Qataris should be the intermediaries, and we do have to give them credit. There was a meeting in Doha over the summer, and the Omanis also have been very active. I'm not so sure, particularly on the nuclear file, but in terms of trying to get dual nationals, American detainees like the Namazis released from Iran. So they have been doing a lot of work as well, and we need to give them credit. But the real heavy lifting has been Enrique Mora, Josep Borrell, the European Union and their staff, as well as the E3. So Azadeh, we've seen some statements that have come out from the E3 and the EU suggesting people are pretty frustrated with the fact that they haven't gotten this accomplished over the summer. Where are the Europeans now, and what's their mood? Do they still think that they can pull this iron out of the fire?
Thank you, Barbara. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here as always. Coming in from a European perspective, as you rightfully said, I mean, there's a high sense of frustration, of course, in Europe. There has been frustration for quite some time now, but particularly given that the August initiative seemed so promising, at least in the beginning, but didn't really lead to any significant breakthrough. And now, of course, once again, we hear more calls for abandoning the Vienna track, for abandoning the Jcpoa altogether, as was just recently reiterated once more by the Israeli Prime Minister during his meeting with Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz in Berlin. But there is, I think, a lot of hesitation still on the European side to leave that track behind. And I think Scholz made that clear when he said that, of course, he shares the interest in preventing Iran from ever acquiring nuclear weapons, but that Germany would still remain patient, and they're still pursuing this path because it's the right path to take. Now, I think for the Europeans, it will be incredibly difficult to move into in an entirely different direction now by essentially declaring the deal dead by triggering snapback in the UN Security Council, for instance. This would be something that would be an incredibly hard step to take under the current conditions, at least. The snapback would mean, of course, snapping back the nuclear UN sanctions, but it would also go hand in hand, of course, then with the reimposition of nuclear-related EU sanctions against Iran. So this would possibly build more economic pressure on Iran. Whether that pressure would be really enough, I think, is an open question, or something that Nader can certainly answer to. But it would certainly also contribute to further isolation of Iran. But it comes with a lot of risks from a European perspective. One of these risks has already been mentioned by Nasser Hadian, that namely that Iran has threatened in the past that under such a scenario, they would withdraw from the NPT, which would be a huge setback for the non-proliferation regime. They might also be further incentivized actually to go for a bomb, or increase already in the high enrichment that they're already pursuing right now. So this comes with a lot of risk that would also include military strikes against nuclear sites in Iran, with the potential of all-out kind of military confrontation. But an all-out military confrontation is precisely what prompted the E3 in 2003 to start negotiations with Iran on its nuclear file. I mean, that was the main concern back then, for once, to prevent a major new nuclear proliferation crisis, and to prevent a major military escalation, to then find themselves in the same spot that they tried to prevent after years of really difficult negotiations and all that they have invested in keeping this deal alive. I think would be devastating and kind of a colossal failure. So I think for now, what the Europeans are trying to do is still preserve the path that we are on by trying to build potentially on the initiative that they had put forward in August, which will be difficult. I think for now they need to figure out and make some sense of recent Iranian responses, because I think Europeans are not really entirely clear on Iranian intentions right now. They have doubts that there is serious intention on really trying to revive the deal. So there needs to be some sorting out at this point. They will most likely not come forward with an entirely new initiative, because as they said already in a recent E3 statement, what was kind of suggested and proposed in the August proposal had already taken at least the E3 to the limits of their flexibility, as they called it. So this is going to be very difficult to, you know, just start entirely new and come up with something entirely different. So they will try to see if there's still some space for any kind of agreement based on the kind of proposal that they have put forward in August. But at the same time, I think what they need to do is now to really come up with a contingency plan that needs to be put in place. Obviously, the situation that we are in right now didn't come out of the blue. Europeans have been discussing different scenarios for months now. This is not something that is entirely surprising. But now is the time, I think, where concrete steps are needed. And here, I think I disagree with Nasser Hadian, and I think Kelsey already alluded to that. I don't think we can go for a simple freeze for freeze in the way, at least, that has been described here, by saying we should just do nothing and not further escalate. I think we are past that. We are past the point where we can just sit back and hope that nobody would escalate, particularly because of the monitoring issues that we've been seeing in these past weeks and months. So some of the ideas that have been circulating, I think one of them most prominently is certainly the idea of an interim agreement. I think Nasser Hadian also alluded to something maybe like that in one of his suggestions. I think he called it a temporary agreement. I would think this is some sort of an interim agreement. This is not really a notion that has been entertained by the Europeans. I think this is not a very attractive kind of scenario for them, because they believe that it still contains too many major obstacles to overcome and would take a lot of time. So this would still be too big to handle, essentially. So this wouldn't really help us. Other suggestions that we've just recently heard also in the public realm, something like having a series of single measure commitments, I think is probably far more realistic, something that might be achievable. But I think for now, what the Europeans would have to do is to coordinate with the United States and amongst themselves to really define their number one priority. What is the number one issue right now, the most pressing one that needs to be addressed under the current circumstances, because I don't think the current situation is actually sustainable. And I would think that the most pressing issue right now is, as Kelsey has said, the monitoring and verification issue. I think this is the most problematic one by far. It's far more problematic and important than the degree to which Iran is enriching uranium right now. It's far more important and pressing as the Iaea probe and Iran's past transgressions, as important as all these things still are. I think the fact that we are in a situation where we can no longer really reliably verify that Iran's nuclear program is of peaceful nature only, I think this is a very unsustainable and dangerous situation. For one, it means that even now, and Kelsey already laid out the problems that might occur even if we come back to full implementation of monitoring provisions. But even now, under the current situation where we don't really have a full picture of what's going on the ground in Iran in terms of nuclear activities, the danger for a military escalation is quite high, because the uncertainty alone might prompt actors like Israel, but also others, to go for military strikes, even if Iran isn't even trying to pursue any kind of weapons-related activities. And I think this is a very dangerous situation to be in. Furthermore, it would actually force us to be increasingly more dependent on intelligence services to get information on what's going on. And I don't think anyone in the world can be comfortable with relying on intelligence. At least we shouldn't be comfortable with relying on intelligence. There's so much room for mistakes, for over and underestimation. There's room for manipulation. There's just such a combination of disastrous factors that could come together that I don't think this is something that we should aspire. So we need, the kind of verification and monitoring measures that were put in place in the Jcpoa, that were the main benefits of the Jcpoa, the reason why we had this agreement to begin with. This should be the number one priority. It's a necessity that needs to be achieved. If this is something that is defined as a number one priority, then of course we have to come to terms with what the kind of price is that we are willing to pay to get to that point. Again, I'm talking about a scenario where we cannot really revive the Jcpoa under current conditions. And here, of course, we can talk about a lot of different things, whether it's unfreezing certain assets, whether it's about talking about maybe temporary oil waivers that would, for instance, allow Iran to export all of its 100 million barrel of oils that is still in storage on top of its, already existing exports, for instance, or other different kind of parameters that could be defined. But I think this is a space, as difficult as it may be to find a solution, where it's still easier to find compromise on one single issue, and that's the most pressing one, in my opinion, at least, rather than going for an interim deal or for a series of different kind of single issues and red lines that would have to be defined, even though, of course, they could be added later on. But this seems to me to be the most feasible thing that could be done in case we cannot revive anything at this point. It would buy us time potentially to the midterm and maybe even beyond the midterm elections, where we might have a different kind of political environment that opens up a little bit, potentially, we don't know, but that might open up a little bit more of political space in those capitals that are decisive here, which is obviously Washington and Tehran. Europeans have played a significant role so far in the nuclear negotiations. They will continue to play a significant role. They are mediators. They are in charge of the shuttle diplomacy. They are the ones, delivering messages, and they are the ones also putting in initiative, but they are not in the driver's seat. So we need to be realistic here. Of course, this is not a question that can be solved by Europeans or Europeans alone. Last comment again on the snapback issue and why I really think it would be a really difficult thing for the Europeans to go for. In other words, to just let the JCPOA fall apart entirely, is also because despite, on top of all these kind of dangers that we talked about the new kind of military escalation, it would fall on the Europeans. It would be a very uncomfortable position to actually trigger that mechanism. The United States is no longer and hasn't been a party of the JCPOA for more than 4 years now. They're not a member of the Joint Commission. The United States cannot trigger the snapback mechanism. Russia and China won't. So it will fall on one of the European actors, some of them at least could, move that procedure forward at a time where Europe is already facing tremendous challenges in its own neighborhood, given Russia's war in Ukraine, given the European energy crisis. So there are so many factors coming in that would put Europe in a really difficult position where they don't really want to give up on a diplomatic path, as long as they believe there's still even a minuscule chance to find some kind of diplomatic breakthrough. And maybe just as final comment, I also think that Europeans are well aware that, in fact, and I would very much agree with that assessment, there's no other really long-term solution to Iran's nuclear crisis. We cannot solve it militarily. Even militarily, we would, in the best case, just be able to delay the process. We wouldn't find a solution that would be lasting. So in any case, we would have to try to work to find an agreement of some sorts. And I think for now, if we cannot revive what we had already in place, then let's focus on the most pressing issue, try to freeze it then under this framework. And here I think what Nasser Hadian said would work just fine. If you have the most pressing issue under some sort of control, then we can go for freeze, and under the umbrella of nobody escalating, can get through the next upcoming month and hopefully reach a stage where there's more room to maneuver.
Thank you very much. I think those are really constructive suggestions both you and Nasser put forward in terms of increasing the monitoring of the program by the IAEA, because you're absolutely right. It was the promise of full and complete verification of the Iranian program that as much as the rolling back of the enrichment and so on, that really made and still makes the Jcpoa, I think, a very valuable non-proliferation agreement. There were a couple of questions related to the European role. One was about whether Iran could provide natural gas to Europe. Now, I think we know that Iran barely satisfies its own natural gas demand, domestic demand, but Iran does have, as you point out, a great deal of oil, which would certainly come in handy for Europe during this winter, with the sanctions continuing on Russia and efforts to get off Russian energy. Another suggestion that was made, has been raised by some, is that Europeans could provide some sort of economic guarantees that would go beyond what the US could promise, so that if the US were to withdraw from the deal again, there would still be I don't know, a pot of money on the table that Europe would have put together that could compensate Iran. I don't know if any of that strikes you as realistic, but I'll put that forward. Is there a possibility, or is Europe still going to, I mean, if the US pulls out again, are we going to see a repeat of the situation where Europe could not provide Iran with economic benefits to compensate?
I mean, one would hope that Europe would be able or willing to do so. But if I look at their track record with regard to the JCPOA so far, they haven't really been able to compensate for the fallouts that come with the US withdrawal. And I don't see anything substantial having changed since then. And I think whatever Europeans are willing and feel like they're capable to put forward on the table, they have already put on the table. So I'm not really sure that anything more revolutionary will come out from the European side with regard to this question. Do I personally think they might have been able to do more in the past? Yes, I do. I think they could have done more. But the reality of the situation is, and we've seen it, very clearly also with the new Biden administration, that Europe hasn't really taken the path of having this kind of strategically autonomous kind of economic policy that wouldn't be that heavily reliant also on US policy. So maybe I'm not that optimistic on that front, that whatever they have put on the table now could be, expanded in a substantial way. But on the natural gas, as you said, I mean, very briefly, because I'm sure Nadra has I mean, it's her expertise. She can probably elaborate on that way more. But yes, it's also my understanding that in terms of natural gas, I think in short term, we lack the pipelines. We don't have the technological framework for Iran to actually export natural gas to Europe. So I don't see Iran being the immediate gas compensating actor for Europe right now, and Europeans are not regarding them as that. That would require far more investment also in Iran's energy sector, which would be a great place for Europeans to invest if a deal were to be revitalized, and hopefully we see that happen.
Okay. So Nadra, you are our final speaker, and I'd love to get your impressions. You know, Iran is trying very, very hard to show that its resistance economy is sufficient and that they don't need the JCPOA. It would be nice, but it's not required. They're surviving quite well. Tell us what you know about how much oil they're able to sell, how well they are doing or not doing. I mean, we see some very alarming inflation figures. We have a piece up on our Iran Source blog today about figures as high as 60% inflation. Here in the United States, we're complaining bitterly about 8%, but I can't even imagine what 60% would be like. And of course, today, the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, is at a meeting in Samarkand with other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, again, trying to show that with Russia and China and Central Asians and other neighbors, Iran can do very well without Europe and the West. How well has Iran been doing over the last few years? And what's the trajectory if Iran does go back into the JCPOA or doesn't?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this very enriching discussion, and I have benefited greatly from what was already said. One can actually summarize the Iranian economic situation in one sentence, or even in one word or two words: not very well. Far beyond or below its capacity as an economy that could have tremendous upside potential. But just to kind of give you a few numbers to bite on, the growth rate last year was not bad. It was 3.7 according to the studies by the parliament, by the Economic Commission of the Parliament. The economy grew by 3.7%. Now, it came from several years of very low or negative growth, and there has been pent-up demand from the COVID period, and people had held back in essentially purchasing or consuming the long-term or the more durables that they needed. So there was a bit of an upswing back to 3.7. The oil sector actually did worse because the non-oil sector did better than the average. The non-oil sector grew by about 3.9%, according to the numbers by the parliament. Now, yes, inflation is very high. It's 60%, but I think a large part of it is also due to the monetary policies of the government, and they could do something they could do something to lower the inflation rate, but there's a lot of deficit spending, incredibly frivolous types of programs. I can come back to them if need be, that are essentially cash injections into the economy that are not necessary. The exchange rate has been depreciating against the dollar, but not as much, in my view, not as much as it could have. A large part of it is because a large part of Iran's trade is with Europe, or at least still existing trade is with Europe, and with the European euro, with the euro weakening against the dollar. So the exchange rate hasn't really depreciated as much as it could have had under normal circumstances. But nonetheless, it has been depreciating. It has reached, it was reaching close to 32,000 tumans, 320,000 riyals per dollar, but it has declined. And I come back to this in a little while again. The prospects for the future, according again to the Majlis, are not bad, in the sense that they expect close to 8% growth in the agriculture sector, which is a very important sector, particularly when Iran's access to world markets may not be very, very high. They expect about 8% growth because there has been a lot of rainfall, almost too much rainfall this year. And therefore, it's going to maybe offset a little bit more the decline in some of the other sectors, most notably construction, which has been in most cases, in most periods, sort of like the driving force of the Iranian economy. Because if you can't invest anywhere, you invest in housing, you invest in better housing, and so on. So there has been a sharp decline in the construction sector. Manufacturing has picked up slightly. I had the number somewhere, but I can't find it right now. But it has picked up somewhat because of Iran is a large population, has a large population, and as a result, it has a large market, and domestic producers, particularly domestic producers of everyday consumables, have actually stepped in, be it from clothing to pharmaceuticals to just everything that you would buy, let's say in the grocery store or in a department store, is now being produced by domestic producers, and as a result, there has been some uptick. Now, is it enough to kind of counter the negative impact of a no deal on the Jcpoa? It's unlikely. It's unlikely that Iran could continue as it is, because Iran needs foreign markets. It's true that the oil sector hasn't grown, but the oil sector has in a way been the financial sort of source for the rest of the economy to grow. And without Iran being able to sell its oil, I mean, currently it's selling about maybe a million barrels per day, which is very little for a country the size of Iran, or at least the market of Iran. It could easily triple or quadruple that amount under normal circumstances. So it is doubtful that it would be able to grow as much or do without the Jcpoa deal. Of course, if there is a deal, the benefit is most likely going to be noticeable by average Iranians who, because all of these sanctions have an incredible cost, intermediation cost in terms of the intermediaries add always at every step of the way, they add to the cost of imports and so on. And of course, with a deal, that cost will be diminished by a considerable amount. I don't want to say will be totally diminished, because there will always be middlemen, persons that will be benefiting from Iran's lower access to world markets. But nonetheless, there would be some benefit, quite a bit of benefits to Iranians. Now, if there is no deal, what would be the impact of no deal? I think that Iran, the Iranian manufacturing and the Iranian industry business sectors has been so much in limbo. They have been sort of like holding in their breath. Today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow will be a deal. So let us wait until we have a little bit more certainty before we make business decisions. If there is no deal, then that uncertainty is gone, and people can make their decisions or can make adjustments accordingly. I'm not saying that these will be perfect circumstances to make decisions, but at least there will be more of a certainty that there is no deal. I'll give you an example. For instance, just in the last couple of days, the Iranian rial was depreciating against the dollar considerably. And just yesterday, when the Iaea decided not to come up with a resolution, but just a statement, there was a sigh of relief in the exchange rate market, and the exchange rate appreciated slightly, not a lot, but slightly compared to the dollar. So there is this. I mean, once you know it is what it is, you make decisions, and and there is a big enough market inside Iran that some industrialists could benefit from. Now, I believe that the sort of like the nirvana that has been painted or that has been projected for the Iranians, that if the deal goes through, there will be the foreign investors would be beating themselves or beating over each other, or running over each other to Iran to invest. I think that's probably not going to take place, or it's going to be highly improbable, for several reasons. One is that even with the Jcpoa agreement, Iran still has to deal with the FATF situation, with all of these access to and the Palermo agreement. So that's going to dampen a little bit the ability of foreign investors to come in or to be able to freely transact. The second thing is the whole issue with the succession. I mean, there is a big, I mean, more than the midterm elections in the United States, or I don't know, other places, there's a big elephant in the room, and that is going to have a great deal of uncertainty for the Iranian decision makers. Who's going to succeed? And under what circumstances are going to be this, if and when the supreme leader, leaves this world? So that's going to be a big uncertainty, and businesses don't like too much uncertainty. And so that's going to be an important factor. The third factor that I would like to add to it is that many of the problems that the Iranian business sector experiences, the huge cost of doing business in Iran and so on. Just yesterday or a couple of days ago, the rankings for Iran for the economic freedom report came out. Iran is 170th in the world. So there are 170 countries ahead of Iran that could attract foreign investors. And it sank from 159, which was its ranking in the last report, to 170. So things are getting worse. And these are things that are actually in the control of the government, of Mr. Raisi, his cabinet, and so on. And it would have been advisable for them to address some of these issues while these discussions about the Jcpoa are going on, so that when the agreement, and if and when the agreement goes through, Iran can say, not only do we have this agreement, but we now have a really conducive investment environment. We have a really conducive business environment. They haven't done that. Instead, what has happened is that the degree and the level and the number of corruption cases is just staggering. I mean, every day there is something new, and that discourages not only the foreign investors, because the foreign investor doesn't know with whom to deal with, but then also the domestic investors. And there has been a great deal of of capital flight to Turkey, benefiting from the lowering, I mean, the decline of the lira and elsewhere. It has been a great exodus of investors. So I would say that some of the issues that Iran is facing or will be facing, regardless of JCPOA or not JCPOA, are self-inflicted, and they can be and they must be addressed by Iran itself in order to provide a better environment. Now, I just want to maybe close by saying that, in my view, every time that we have all held our breaths that the deal is going to happen, and it's going to happen today, it's going to happen overnight, and so on. Every time that it doesn't happen, to me, it seems that the Iranian side is making always a kind of a strange decision, a strange sort of a cost-benefit analysis and cost-benefit decision, and most of it is because of the fact that they think that that Iran is so indispensable to the world, that the Iranian economy is so indispensable to the world, and that for instance, every time that we were close to the deal and suddenly let's say Ukraine happened, and then they said, oh, you know what, the world needs us, so therefore they're going to really buy into our stronger, or they raised their demands. Or, for instance, Europe is going to have a terrible winter, so therefore, let us harden our bargaining position because Europe needs us, and they won't survive the winter. So every time there is this in a way analysis that we can do better if we demand more. And instead of saying, okay, now perhaps we can sort of like move into a more positive environment, and maybe we can be it can benefit us more from, let's say, selling oil to Europe, or benefiting from this crisis the war in Ukraine. So all of these miscalculations play a big role, in my view, in Iran's bargaining position, and also in the way that it's projected to its internal, to the base of the government. I will stop here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Great, that was very helpful. And I find it fascinating that the mere fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors issued a statement and not a resolution was sufficient to have an impact on the foreign exchange markets in Iran. It's, the interconnectedness of Iran's economy with the rest of the world is something that
actually, if I can maybe add a few, because
sure.
Some people again, Iran is full of conspiratorial, how should I say, trends, and some people say, oh, you know what, from time to time they drop a hint or a rumor or a gossip here and there, so that the market will react. Let's say, in other words, the exchange rate would depreciate, so that they could, the insiders could benefit from it, and then of course they can sell it at a more expensive expensive rate later on. So in other words, there are all of these stories about the exchange rate and what the developments are in Vienna.
I want to now turn to, we have a lot of questions that have piled in, and one of them you touched on a little bit about the reports that the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, there have been a variety that have been floating around that he is either no longer with us or has suffered some sort of major health setback. And you address that this actually could create even more uncertainty. But I'll just say that the Supreme Leader's office now has said that he will appear on Saturday at an event with university students. So I think Obviously, if he does, that's the best way to deal with those rumors. And if he doesn't, I'm afraid these theories are going to mushroom about his state. I would say that I would assume that even though something like that, obviously, if the supreme leader passes from the scene after 30 years, it is an earthquake. In Iran, he is 83 years old, and the system has been preparing for this moment for a long time, and presumably would be able to arrange an orderly succession of some sort without a great deal of disruption. That's just my own impression. But obviously, folks, stay tuned. Yes, I'll go back to you, Nadre, just about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Does this really help Iran economically? We can ask about strategically, maybe I'll ask Nasser about strategic implications, but in economic terms, does it really make much of a difference? Iran has its own deals with China, with Russia, and various other countries.
I think perhaps in the long run, it would help, but I think in the short run, most, at least from what I see business-wise, that most Iranian businessmen look westward. They do not consider, Turkmenistan is not a very big market for them. Uzbekistan is not a very big. It could grow. It could become maybe at some point in time. But of course, in the short run, in the next 1 or 2 or 3 years, it's not considered. It's not a game changer for Iran in that sense. But of course, every trade agreement is important, particularly if you're so marginalized in the world economy. Every relation that you have would be useful. But I think that the fear that I have, and that's sort of like based on the experience with Azerbaijan, with Georgia, with other countries, there is going to be an outflow of capital to these countries because Iranians will consider that these countries are going to be a better haven for their capital than Iran itself, based on economic freedom.
All right, thanks. Let me go back to Nasser, ask you about the strategic calculation and why Iran has thrown its lot in with Putin, particularly on Ukraine, when, as we all know, Russia has not historically been a particularly popular country in Iran. Iranians have bad memories of Russian and Soviet imperialism. And I have another one for you, but let me ask you to take that one first, Nasser.
Okay. To be frank with you, I guess to a large extent, it has been because of the Europe and then US, which have pushed Iran basically in the arms of Russia or China. But of course, there is a still huge debate here regarding Russia and China. But the majority view is Russia is a declining power in the world politics, is a declining power, but China is a rising power. So same as Europe. So it is going to be basically a unipolar world, which US would be at the top for next 25 years at least. And then China may be able to challenge the US. There are groups in Iran who would argue that we should get closer to China. There is not a debate now to get closer to China. Almost there is a consensus. Mm-hmm. We have to get close to China. But there are two views there. One would say that we have to go to become in the orbit of China. But there are others who would say that, no, we have to go for a much more stronger relationship with China, but not to be in the orbit of China. China would need us in the future for two important reasons. So far, China has been looking at Iran basically as a market, and we have been looking at China as a factory. But that is being changed. China is trying to translate its economic presence to political presence in Iran. because of the two reasons which I'm going to mention. One is, so far China has been free rider, relying basically on US for providing the security for the energy. China now needs to provide that security itself. And number two is stabilization of the Middle East. It is very important Middle East is stabilized and secure. So far, again, the US has provided that. But now China, they know that they have to provide it itself. Thus, when they look at Iran, these are the two main considerations. Number one is Iran is an important source of energy for them. But number two, which is even more important than the first one, is Iran has the power to destabilize the region. May not be able to stabilize it, but certainly it has the power to destabilize it. Thus, they have to exercise some sort of a political influence. That's what I say, that they are trying to translate their economic presence to a political presence and political influence. Thus, they are going to influence Iran regarding our presence in the region. Arguably, far more important, far more significant than US was ever able to, at least since the revolution, to influence Iran regarding its behavior in the region. So that's why for the future, I think China, we are going to get closer to China, and China is going to exercise important influence in Iran. But with Russia is far different. With Russia is a sort of a temporary relationship. We may have a sort of enhanced relationship. For instance, a group of 80 important and significant business people from Russia are going to come to Iran within the next few days. Okay, so we are getting far closer. I had a talk just a couple of days ago in Iran's Chamber of Commerce, Tehran's Chamber of Commerce. And they are very much, they are in such a good situation. They don't know what to do, how to deal with the Russians now. Thus, there is a better relationship, but that's going to be temporary. No one is under any illusion that Russia is a declining power.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Let's go back to another question I have for you, Nasser, and this one is quite serious. You said that if escalation occurs, it would occur regionally, and the question is, what would that entail? I can imagine. Aren't we already seeing regional escalation by Iran-backed actors in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon? How would this escalation differ from what we're currently witnessing? So give us your worst case scenario.
It's far, far different from that. It's very much a managed interaction with the US, very much under control. Nothing is happening. But if there is going to be a war, within 48 hours, we're going to see thousands of missiles are going to pour into Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
Thousands. Okay, not only from Iran, but from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Yemen, so forth and so on. The US also is going to attack Iran, is going to inflict a lot of damage. Naturally, they're going to do it. So, and the result would be Iran would suffer a lot, but many others are going to suffer as well. So that's why I say that I don't prefer the freeze. I don't prefer the temporary agreement. I don't prefer the escalation. I think still the best plan is Jcpoa. So that's what I'm looking for. But in case we don't have that one, to articulate my point very clearly, let's go for just only one or two issues.
Yeah.
Okay, that we can in the track two, we can articulate those two issues, and also say that, okay, if you do these two things, we are ready to give you these two things.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we can go, as Azad said, we can go for freeze. Okay, then because things are going to be less sensitive. This is like a minimalist temporary or intermediate plan. Okay, so then we can work on the JCPOA, because to me still the JCPOA still is the most reliable alternative. Although personally I have called for, I have asked from Iranian authorities to go for another kind of a deal, but they didn't. And now it's too late for them.
Yeah.
It's too late for them to go for what I proposed 15 months ago.
All right, I'm going to stop you there. Believe it or not, we are already running short on time. There was one question here which Azadeh already answered, which was the number one issue for the Europe and the United States, and that was to increase the monitoring. Let me turn that over to Kelsey. Would you agree that the most important step, if we can't get the full JCPOA back in the next few weeks, would be to improve the monitoring situation now in Iran?
Yeah, absolutely. The monitoring really is the most critical, because if you can't reconstruct that record of activity and you cannot, reliably verify that Iran's nuclear materials and that the components related to its nuclear program, remain in peaceful purposes, it not only affects trying to restore the JCPOA, but it could also make any future deals sort of much more difficult. And I said, so long as that uncertainty is there, that's an area where critics of any type of diplomacy with Iran could really criticize any future deal and raise concerns about verification. But I also think the monitoring is an interesting and important point to focus on, because that's where I think you're the most likely to get assistance, particularly from the Russians. The Russians have played an important role in the past in trying to facilitate IAEA engagement with Iran on the monitoring question, and they've raised concerns themselves about the monitoring gap. And so given that, Moscow seems to have more influence in Tehran right now than any of the other parties to the JCPOA, actually trying to, negotiate some type of gap bridging, monitoring arrangement that prevents those more problematic scenarios that could impact future diplomacy. That's an area where I think, diplomacy really could succeed, particularly with Russian support and Russia perhaps spearheading that effort.
I think China
will.
will.
A question for Kelsey. What is the number two?
I would say the number. I mean, I would put as number two, if we're looking at the activities that Iran is engaging in right now, halting the further installation or new cascade configurations for its advanced centrifuges, because those are the activities that, if talks to restore the JCPOA restart, the text that's been drafted may have to be modified to try to take some of those research advancements into account. That could prolong and drag out negotiations. And again, as Iran masters and produces more of these advanced centrifuges, masters their operation, that just negates some of the non-proliferation benefits of the JCPOA. I mean, already because of these activities, restoration of the JCPOA will not restore that 12-month breakout period that was established by the JCPOA when it was fully implemented. I mean, right now we're looking at perhaps a 4 to 6 month breakout, which is, from a non-proliferation perspective, is acceptable. That's enough time for the international community to respond. But if that chips down even further, then it becomes, I think, much more difficult to sell the deal in the United States as something that still benefits U.S. non-proliferation priorities, and still, and is deserving of the level of sanctions relief that the United States would grant Iran in response. So yeah, monitoring, advanced centrifuge development, and then I would put, not undertaking any work on uranium metal as a third priority, just because that is a capability that's directly tied to the weaponization process. And I think it's a technical capability that Iran has experience with, but hasn't yet mastered. So that's how I'd rank the priorities.
Kelsey, I've got
that's possible. You can tell Kelsey it's very much doable.
All right. Well, I'm glad we're resolving all of this via the Atlantic Council. This is terrific.
With a good price, of course.
There's one more question for you, Kelsey, and this is on whether the traces of uranium in these three sites, are they any different in kind or property than previous traces found in other places? Do you know anything more about these traces?
Sure. So there is, actually there was a fourth location under investigation where it looked like Iran had undertaken activities related to uranium metal. And the uranium metal traces at that site, appeared to be consistent with some of the uranium metal work that Iran had done at other locations. So there's consistency there. And then also, as I think I mentioned, the isotopic composition of the processed uranium that was detected at these sites, appears to be consistent with the processes and the technologies that Iran bought from the AQ-Khan network, AQ-Khan being the notorious Pakistani proliferator. So again, that would be kind of consistent with uranium that Iran had produced, using the Khan technology as a basis.
Okay. There are a lot of questions about Israel. So Azadeh, I'm going to stick you with those. A whole bunch about, what do we do because Mossad pledges to continue its covert operations regardless of the status of the JCPOA. There are a couple questions here about, was it unwise for the U.S. and Western countries to involve Israel so visibly in consultation in the formulation of the terms of the deal? Let's see, another one here. What do we do to push back against Israel's comments against the deal and so on? Before you answer, I'll just say that the fact that the Israelis are so up in arms over this deal suggests to me that Iran should grab it, because if the Israelis aren't happy with it, that means it's a good deal for Iran, right? In the same way that we argued back in 2015 that if Bibi Netanyahu was so furious about the deal, it must be a good deal for Iran. But how do you deal with this? I mean, the Biden administration has said repeatedly, yes, they consult, but they don't take dictation from any other country. Is there anything you can do about all of this Israeli noise, especially since they're in an election season too?
It seems at least that Israel did have some impact, at least when it came to the FTO question, for instance. That's one incident where we know that they had some impact on decision shaping, at least to a certain degree. Of course, it's a problem, but the Israelis have been against the nuclear agreement right from the start, even before 2015 and after 2015. Yet it was not the Israelis that actually derailed the deal. It was the United States that derailed it. So even if we just cancel out all the noise that we're hearing, it has not been Israel that was the game changer with regard to the trajectory of the nuclear deal so far. Obviously, we don't see much rhetorical pushback by the Europeans or United States when it comes to the Israeli position, but we do see a different stance, at least in Europe. And as I mentioned before, Bundeskanzler Scholz has made it clear that though he does share the sentiment and the concerns, he doesn't share the assessment and the approach. And I think that's important to note. After all, I don't think the Israelis have made it, convincingly clear what kind of solution they actually have to put forward. And if military solution is the answer here, then we would have to say, well, I don't see that kind of solution, because there isn't a military solution. Some of the criticism that we've seen from the Israelis, for instance, saying, well, there are sunsets and we're running out of time. And let's say after 10, 15, 20 years, Iran can, increase its nuclear activities. Yes, the nuclear deal is essentially delaying certain processes that we can work on during the time, but a military strike wouldn't change that equation at all. It would also only delay the process. And if I can choose between delaying the process through military means or diplomatic ones, I will always go for the diplomatic ones that don't, harbor this kind of huge danger of escalation here. And on top of that, obviously, we are all aware Iran is not a single target operation that you would have to conduct here with regard to its nuclear activities compared to Iraq or Syria in the past. And in the end, some of the activities, as Kelsey had said, are already irreversible. Iran would come back. As El Baradei once said, you can't bomb knowledge. So in other words, I don't see the military kind of proposition that we can just leave the JCPOA behind and miraculously we will solve it in through military terms. I don't see that happening, and I don't think Israel has a convincing case here.
Okay, well, believe it or not, we have exhausted our hour and a half. With this panel, I could go on a great deal longer, but I think we've put some very constructive ideas on the table. Thank you, Nasser. Thank you, Azadeh. Thank you, Nadere. Thank you, Kelsey. And let's hope that that folks are listening in a variety of capitals, and that we do see some progress on this front. And thank you all very, very much again, and hope to see you all soon at the Atlantic Council in person or on the screen. So everyone be well, and thank you again for attending. We really appreciate it.
Finished? Yeah, okay. Thank you, take care, yeah.